Chapter 6. Mr. Bassett's Visit. That night, the wagons came again. This time, they arrived empty and were loaded with the last of the goods which had been left at the inn the time before. Mary guessed that this was their way of working. The inn was used as a store for a few weeks at a time, and then, when the opportunity came, the wagons set out once more, and the goods were carried to the river bank and transported to different places from there. The organisation must be a big one, and there would be agents scattered far and wide who kept the necessary watch on events. It was with a sudden sting of disappointment that Mary wondered whether the visit of Jem Merlin to Jamaica Inn that morning had been important. How strange that the wagons came so soon after him. He had come from Launceston, he said, and Launceston stood on the river bank. Mary was angry with him and with herself. In spite of everything, her last thought before sleeping had been the possibility of his friendship. She would be a fool if she had hopes of it now. Jem might disagree with his brother, but it was clear that they were both in the same trade. It was a miserable, bad business in every way, and here she was, in the middle of it all, with Aunt Patience like a child to be looked after. The next few days passed uneventfully. Then there came a fine, cold morning when, for a change, the sun shone in a cloudless sky. Mary, whose spirits always rose at the sight of the sun, had turned her morning into a washing day. She felt well and sang as she worked. Her uncle had ridden away on the moors somewhere, and a sense of freedom possessed her whenever he was away. An urgent knocking at the window made her look up, and she saw Aunt Patience making signs to her, very white in the face and clearly frightened. Mary wiped her hands and ran to the back door of the house.
"It's Mr. Bassett from North Hill," Aunt Patience whispered. "I saw him from the window. He's come on horseback, and another gentleman with him. Oh, my dear, what are we going to do?"
Mary thought quickly. She was in a very difficult position. If this Mr. Bassett represented the law, it was her one chance of telling someone about her uncle. She could tell him about the wagons and about everything that she had seen since her arrival. She looked down at the trembling woman at her side. By now, there was a continuous hammering on the door.
"Mary, if Mr. Bassett asks you what you know, you won't answer him, will you? I can trust you, can't I? You'll not tell him of the wagons. If any danger came to Joss, I'd kill myself, Mary."
There was no argument after that. Mary opened the heavy entrance door. There were two men outside. One had climbed down from his horse. It was he who had rained the blows on the door. The other was still on horseback. His face was brown and heavily lined. Mary judged him to be about 50 years of age. "You don't hurry here, do you?" he called. "There doesn't seem to be much of a welcome for travellers. Is the landlord at home?"
"If you please, Mr. Bassett, my husband went out as soon as he had eaten his breakfast, and whether he will be back before night, I cannot say."
"That's a pity. I wanted a word or two with Mr. Joss Merlin." Mr. Bassett climbed heavily to the ground. "While I'm here, I may as well look round, and I'll tell you here and now, it's useless to refuse me. I am a magistrate, and I have the necessary documents." He pushed his way past the two women. Aunt Patience made a movement as though to prevent him, but Mary said quietly, Let him go. If we try to stop him now, we shall only anger him the more." The rooms were thoroughly explored. The magistrate looked into the dusty corners, lifted old bags and boxes, examined the stores of food, all the time crying out in anger and disgust. "Call this an inn, do you? You haven't even got a bed fit for a cat to sleep on. The place is horrible. What does it mean, eh? Have you lost your tongue, Mrs. Merlin?" The poor woman could not reply. She kept shaking her head and working her mouth, and Mary knew that she was wondering what would happen when they came to the locked room in the passage. "What about you, young woman? Have you anything to say?" "I'm here to look after my aunt. She's not very strong. You can see that for yourself. She's easily frightened." "I don't blame her, living in a place like this. Well, kindly show me the room that has barred windows. I noticed it from the yard, and I'd like to see inside." "I'm very sorry, sir," Mary replied. "But if you mean the old storeroom at the end of the passage, I'm afraid the door is locked. My uncle always keeps the key, and where he puts it, I don't know." "Well, that's easily settled. We'll have the door down in no time." He went out into the yard to call his servant. In a few minutes, he returned with his man, Richards, who was carrying an iron bar, which he had found in the stable. For a few minutes, the door bore every blow. Then there was a splitting of wood and a crash, and the door gave way. It was dark, of course. The blocked windows kept the light out. The servant produced a light, and the magistrate stepped into the room. For a moment there was silence as the magistrate turned, letting the light shine in every corner, and then, making sounds of annoyance and disappointment, he faced the little group behind him. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing at all. The landlord has made a fool of me again." Except for a pile of empty bags in one corner, there was nothing in the room. It was thick with dust. There was no furniture of any sort. The fireplace had been blocked up with stones, and the floor itself was of stone, like the passage outside. On top of the bags lay a length of twisted rope. Then the magistrate turned once more into the passage. "Well, Mr. Jos Merlin has won this time. I'll admit myself beaten. Now listen to me," he said, pointing his whip at Mary. "This aunt of yours may have lost her tongue, but you can understand plain English, I hope. Do you mean to tell me you know nothing of your uncle's business? Does nobody ever call here by day or night?" Mary looked him straight in the eye. "I've never seen anyone," she said. "Have you ever looked into that locked room before today?" "No." "Have you any idea why he should keep it locked up?" "No, none at all." "Have you ever heard wheels in the yard by night?" "I'm a very heavy sleeper. Nothing ever wakes me." "Where does your uncle go when he's away from home?" "I don't know." "Don't you think it's very strange to keep an inn on the main road and then to close your door to every traveller?" "My uncle is a very strange man."
That is true. In fact, he's so strange that half the people in the countryside won't sleep quietly in their beds until he's been hanged like his father before him. You can tell him that from me."
He climbed onto his horse.
"One other thing," he called. "Have you seen anything of your uncle's younger brother, Jem Merlin of Trewartha?"
"No," said Mary steadily. "He never comes here."
"Oh,
doesn't he? Well, that's all I want from you this morning. Good day to you both."
And away the two men went from the yard, and so on to the road. Jos Merlin returned just before midday. Mary told him calmly what had happened during the morning. He swore and shouted, but he was frightened, she could see that, and his confidence was shaken.
"Get me something to eat," he said. "I must go out again, and there's no time to waste. You've done well today, Mary, and I'll not forget it."
She looked him in the eyes. "You don't think I did it for you, do you?"
"I don't care why you did it. The result's the same."
As soon as he had finished his meal, the landlord rose to his feet and left the kitchen. Mary watched him cross the moor. She thought for a moment, doubting the wisdom of the sudden plan in her head, and then she ran down the field after her uncle. When she reached the bottom, she bent down beside the stone wall until his figure crossed the skyline and disappeared. And then she jumped up again and followed him, picking her way across the rough grass and stones. It was crazy, no doubt, but her idea was to keep Jos Merlin in view, and in this way to learn something of his secret plan. After a few miles, she realized how difficult it was. She had to keep a good distance between them in order to remain unseen, and the landlord walked at such a speed that before long she saw that she would be left behind. The ground was now soft beneath her feet. The whole of the low-lying plain ahead of her was wet with winter rains. Her uncle had crossed the worst of the low ground with the quickness given by many years of practice. Then he was hidden by a big rock, and she saw him no more. It was impossible to discover the path which he had taken across the marsh, but Mary followed as best she could. She was a fool to attempt it, she knew, but a sort of determined stupidity made her continue. When she reached the top of the hill, the evening clouds were thick and the world was grey. The horizon was hidden. Mary would never find her uncle now. She knew herself to be a fool for having gone so far on a December afternoon. Experience had proved to her that when darkness came on Bodmin Moor, it was sudden and without warning. The low cloud over the marshes was dangerous too. But there was less danger from the marshes if she kept to the high ground, so, pulling up her skirt, she walked steadily forward, feeling the ground with some care when in doubt, and avoiding those places where the grass felt soft and gave way under her feet. Her legs were heavy, and her feet felt as if they hardly belonged to her, and her eyes felt sunken away back in her head. She walked on, her head low and her hands at her side, thinking that the tall grey chimneys of Jamaica Inn would be, for the first time, a welcome sight. The path was wider now, and was crossed by another running from left to right, and Mary stood uncertainly for a few moments, wondering which to take. It was then that she heard the sound of a horse coming out of the darkness to the left. Mary waited in the middle of the track, and after some time the horse appeared out of the low cloud in front of her. The horseman turned sharply to the side as he saw Mary and stopped.
"Hello?" he cried. "Who's there? Is anyone in trouble?"
Then, looking down closely, he said in surprise,
"A woman! What in the world are you doing out here?"
"Can you help me to find the road? I'm miles from home and hopelessly lost."
"Steady there," he said to his horse. "Stand still, will you? Where have you come from? Of course I will help you if I can."
His voice was low and gentle. "I live at Jamaica Inn," she said, and as soon as the words were out of her mouth, she wished she had not said them. For a moment, the man was silent. But when he spoke again, his voice had not changed, but was quiet and gentle as before. "Jamaica Inn," he said. "You've come a long way in the wrong direction, I'm afraid. You're tired out. You're not fit to walk another step. And what's more, I'm not going to let you. We're not far from the village, and you shall ride there. You shall come home with me, and dry your clothes, and rest a little, and have some supper before I take you back myself to Jamaica Inn." He spoke with such kindness, but with such firmness, that Mary trusted him. Then she saw his eyes for the first time beneath the edge of his hat. They were strange eyes, like glass, and so pale in colour that they seemed near to white. His hair was white too, under his black hat, and Mary looked at him in some surprise, because his face was unlined, and his voice was not that of an old man. Then, with sudden embarrassment, she understood, and she turned away her eyes. He was an albino. He took off his hat. "Perhaps I had better introduce myself," he said with a smile. "Even if the meeting is unusual, it is the right thing to do, I believe. My name is Francis Davy, and I am the Vicar of Altarnun."